The sterile silence of the children's ward shattered when Elena Morris's voice cut through the air like a blade. The 4 has been poisoned. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Nurses halted mid-step, monitors beeped in alarm, and little Sophia Hale lay motionless on the hospital bed, her breath shallow and uneven. Her father, Daniel Hale, rushed to her side, panic twisting his face. "What did you say?" he demanded, disbelief warring with fear. Elena, trembling but resolute, insisted she had smelled something chemical, something toxic, right after the drip began. Before anyone could react, Daniel's glamorous wife Vanessa, draped in silk and painted tears, swept into the room. She accused Elena of spreading panic, her voice sharp, her tone rehearsed. But Sophia's lips were turning blue. The urgency escalated when Dr. Harper arrived, quickly, ordering the IV to be disconnected. The solution, she confirmed, had been tampered with. A collective gasp filled the ward. In a heartbeat, Vanessa pointed the finger at Elena, declaring that the caregiver herself must have planted the poison. To everyone's horror, a syringe and vial were discovered in Elena's bag conveniently by Vanessa's own hands. Security moved in swiftly. Elena cried out, swearing her innocence, but her pleas were drowned out by Vanessa's crocodile tears. Daniel's silence cut deeper than the accusations. It seemed the truth was slipping beyond Elena's reach. Until Nurse Margaret rushed in with security footage. On the grainy screen, the damning image appeared. Vanessa, entering the day-dashin screen room alone, syringe in hand, deliberately contaminating the IV. The room fell into stunned silence. The facade crumbled. The predator had worn the mask of a protector. This moment was more than the exposure of a crime. It was a brutal reminder of how quickly truth can be buried under appearances, and how the powerless can be silenced when the powerful manipulate the narrative. Elena's courage to speak up, even while being framed, saved a life. And in that revelation lay a lesson. Evil often hides in plain sight, but so does the quiet strength of those who refuse to stay silent. The arrest of Vanessa Hale should have brought relief. After all, the footage was undeniable. Her own hands had poisoned the IV. Yet the air inside the hospital did not lighten. If anything, the weight of suspicion still clung stubbornly to Elena Morris, the caregiver who had raised the alarm. Even with the truth exposed, whispers circulated through the sterile hallways. She was in the room. Why did she smell the drip so quickly? Maybe she was part of it. The very act of saving a life had left Elena in a fragile position, one where every glance seemed to question whether she had been a hero or a co-conspirator. Daniel Hale, Sophia's father, carried the heaviest burden of guilt. He had watched his wife weep convincingly, had listened to her accuse Elena, and he had believed her, at least for a moment that now felt unforgivable. The look in Elena's eyes, when security pulled her away, still haunted him. Desperate, betrayed, yet unshaken in her insistence on truth. Now that Vanessa was in custody, Daniel began replaying every detail of the past months, the subtle manipulations, the excuses to keep him late at the office, the way Vanessa had subtly undermined Sophia's bond with Elena. What once seemed like small annoyances now glared like crimson warnings he had ignored. But Vanessa had not acted alone. That much became clear when Dr. Harper began a deeper review of hospital access logs. A troubling pattern emerged. The pharmacy storage room, where critical supplies were kept, had been opened without clearance on multiple nights. The badge ID linked to these entries belonged to Diana Norwell, a quiet assistant in hospital logistics. Diana was the kind of person few noticed. Punctual, polite, and invisible. Yet, the logs showed she had repeatedly granted entry to restricted areas outside her scheduled shifts. When investigators questioned her, Diana denied involvement. But fragments of her phone records told a different story: deleted texts, late-night calls, connections that trailed back to Vanessa. The implication was chilling. Vanessa hadn't merely taken advantage of a distracted system. She had help from within, a hand that held the keys to the hospital's most vulnerable doors. For Elena, this revelation was both vindication and torment. She had not imagined the danger, she had seen it clearly. Yet instead of being trusted, she had been treated as the enemy. The bruises on her wrists, left by the security officers who restrained her, were fading, but the memory was fresh. She had shouted for the truth, and nearly been silenced forever. And, though Vanessa was gone, the system that had almost buried her voice still stood. Daniel found himself at a crossroads. He could no longer ignore the corruption that had almost cost his daughter's life. He began asking questions the hospital administration did not want to answer. Who had approved Vanessa's easy access to restricted spaces? Why had the thought-provoking made her initial investigation turned so quickly on Elena? And how many other incidents had been quietly swept under the rug in order to preserve the hospital's image? The responses he received were evasive, buried in jargon, or steeped in bureaucratic denial. Meanwhile, Elena continued her vigil at Sophia's bedside. The little girl stirred more each day, her strength returning slowly. To Sophia, there was no question of trust. She clung to Elena with the instinct of a child who knows who truly loves her. But outside the room, Elena still faced cold stares and sharp questions. Some accused her of exaggerating her story to gain sympathy. Others whispered that she was lucky Vanessa's guilt had been caught on tape, otherwise she would be in prison. Each comment cut deeper than she cared to admit. One evening, as the sun bled through the hospital windows, Daniel approached her quietly. His eyes, tired and shadowed, softened with unspoken remorse. "I should have believed you," he said. Elena looked at him, her voice low but steady. "Belief doesn't come after the fact, Mr. Hale. It comes when no one else is willing to listen." He flinched at the formality, at the way she kept a distance even as she protected his child. But he did not argue, because she was right. The investigation widened, and what it revealed shook even the seasoned officials. Vanessa's plan had been ambitious but not solitary. The hospital's internal review confirmed that Diana Norwell had been bribed, not merely with money, but with promises of influence and stability. In exchange, she had granted Vanessa access to supplies, tampered with clearance logs, and even manipulated inventory records, so that missing vials of sedatives and toxins would go unnoticed. Worse still, it appeared this was not the first time such tampering had occurred. Past anomalies in medication records had been buried under clerical errors, conveniently dismissed before scrutiny could take root. The realization dawned. Vanessa was only the visible fracture. Beneath her lay a web of group lies, negligence, silence, and willful blindness. The hospital had valued its pristine reputation over transparency, allowing rot to spread unchecked. And Elena, because of who she was, employee of little status, a woman of color, a voice too loud for comfort, had become the perfect scapegoat when the truth threatened to surface. Daniel could not stomach it. His wealth and influence had shielded him from many of life's cruelties, but this time, his privilege had blinded him to the evil festering in his own home and the institution sworn to protect his daughter. He resolved to act, not just for Sophia, but for every patient whose life might be endangered by the same shadows. With his resources, he began pressing for an external investigation, one that could not be controlled by the hospital's board. Through it all, Elena remained firm. She had been humiliated, accused, and nearly destroyed. But she did not withdraw. Instead, her presence at Sophia's side became a quiet defiance, a living reminder that truth had survived where deceit had nearly triumphed. And though she carried scars invisible to most, she also carried the knowledge that her vigilance had saved life. The story, however, was far from over. Vanessa was behind bars, Diana was under investigation, but the network that enabled them still lingered. Behind polished doors and clinical smiles, others had looked away, signed papers, or chosen silence. And as Elena watched Sophia's chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep, she knew one thing with certainty. The real confrontation was only beginning. The hospital quieted after the arrests, but for Elena Morris, silence had never felt so heavy. Though Vanessa Hale now faced criminal charges and Diana Norwell awaited trial, Elena still felt the invisible weight of suspicion pressing against her shoulders. Too many colleagues had doubted her. Too many strangers had whispered her name as though it belonged to guilt. She had been framed, humiliated, restrained like a criminal. Yet deep inside, she carried something far heavier than anger, a memory that would not let her rest. Years earlier, in Detroit, Elena had been working as a nurse in a cramped, underfunded hospital. One night, a young boy was wheeled into the ER, barely breathing, his tiny body trembling from a suspected overdose caused by a mislabeled IV. Elena noticed the signs. Immediately, the wrong color tint, the strange chemical scent. She tried to raise the alarm, but her warnings were dismissed. When she took action on her own, disconnecting the drip, demanding tests, she was reprimanded. The boy survived, but Elena was accused of overstepping protocol. By the time administrators finished their investigation, she was dismissed from her post. No one defended her. No one listened. The boy's mother had thanked her quietly before leaving, whispering words Elena never forgot. They'll always try to silence you, but don't stop speaking. That night in Detroit had carved a scar she carried into every ward, every shift, every sleepless night. And now, standing beside Sophia Hale's bed in Beverly Hills, watching the child breathe steadily again, Elena realized she had been brought full circle. She could no longer remain a quiet figure in the background. Her story was no longer just about saving one girl. It was about exposing a pattern that reached beyond a single hospital or a single malicious stepmother. It was about systems that silenced women like her, caregivers who noticed too much, who spoke too loudly, who carried truth in voices people were trained not to believe. When the first journalists arrived, parking their vans outside the hospital, Elena stayed away from the cameras. Daniel advised her to remain silent until his legal team cleared the path. But late at night, when she scrolled through her phone, she saw the headlines. Stepmother accused of poison plot, Beverly Hills Hospital under fire. And buried at the end of each story, her name appeared only in passing, a caregiver, briefly detained under suspicion. The truth of her ordeal was being erased in real time. It was Angela Bryant, the veteran nurse, who had pulled the surveillance footage, who first encouraged her. They won't tell your story for you, Angela said firmly one night over stale coffee in the staff lounge. You'll have to tell it yourself. And not just for you, for everyone. They've ignored before. So Elena did. The first time she spoke publicly was not to the press, but at a medical ethics forum at UCLA, invited by a professor who had heard whispers of her courage. She stood before a room of physicians, nurses, and students, her palms slick with sweat. At first her voice shook, but when she saw Sophia sitting in the front row beside Daniel, her small hands clutching a stuffed bear, her eyes wide with trust, Elena's words found strength. I was taught to protect life, she began. But no one prepared me for what happens when speaking up puts your own life, your own livelihood, at risk. In Detroit, I raised my voice. Once before. I was punished for it. Years later, I did the same here, and again I was treated as guilty before being heard. This is not an accident, it is a pattern. A pattern of silencing those who dare to disrupt comfort with truth. The room went still. Doctors lowered their eyes. Students scribbled furiously in notebooks. For once, no one dismissed her as overdramatic. Her voice carried something raw. Something that could not be polished into corporate language or buried in hospital press statements. Word of her testimony spread quickly. Soon, newspapers began requesting interviews. National outlets picked up her story. The image of a black caregiver, once falsely accused, now standing as the person who had saved a billionaire's child, was impossible to ignore. Some networks tried to frame her as a hero Maid. Others tried to sensationalize her past. Elena rejected both labels. I'm not a symbol of charity, she told one reporter bluntly. I am a worker who refused to stay quiet while a child's life was at risk. That should not be extraordinary, that should be normal. Her bluntness resonated. Invitations poured in from health symposiums, caregiver unions, and eventually, from Capitol Hill. A congressional subcommittee on healthcare ethics asked her to testify. Standing in the polished wood chamber, microphones flashing, Elena told the story again. This time, she did not falter. I was falsely accused, because it was easier to blame me than to admit the system had failed, she declared. It was easier to restrain me than to listen. And if not for a single nurse brave enough to pull camera footage, the lie would have stood. How many others never get that chance? How many children suffer because someone in power decided silence was safer than whizzer truth? Cameras captured her every word. Across the country, families watching at home nodded, cried, clenched fists. She was no longer just Elena Morris, the caregiver. She had become a voice that represented countless others who had been silenced, nurses disciplined for speaking up, mothers dismissed in ERs, caregivers accused when wealthy systems sought scapegoats. Of course, backlash followed. Anonymous threats filled her inbox. Some pundits accused her of seeking fame, of playing the victim. But Elena no longer wavered. Each attempt to smear her name only proved the point she had been making all along. When the powerless demand to be heard, the powerful will always try to drown them out. What Vanessa and Diana had tried to destroy, Elena had transformed into a platform. What the hospital had buried, she unearthed. And in doing so, she became something larger than being herself. A living reminder that truth may be silenced for a moment, but never forever. As she left the Capitol steps that day, Sophia ran up to her and whispered words that echoed, louder than applause. "Everyone heard you." Elena bent down, hugged the little girl tightly, and whispered back, "Good. Then maybe they'll listen next time." That night, as she sat alone in her small apartment, the city lights flickering outside her window, Elena understood that her fight was no longer about clearing her own name. It was about breaking a cycle, about ensuring that no other caregiver would be shackled for daring to scream when a child was in danger. And as exhaustion pulled at her, another force steadied. Here, resolve. She would not be silenced again. The storm inside the hospital eventually quieted, but for Elena Morris, silence was never the goal. Exposing Vanessa Hale and her accomplice had saved Sophia's life, yet the ordeal left behind a lingering truth. Countless children in forgotten neighborhoods were still walking into clinics and emergency rooms, where their voices, or their caregivers' voices, would never be further heard. Elena knew she couldn't stop at surviving the scandal. Survival wasn't enough. Change had to come. Daniel Hale, shaken by how close he had come to losing his daughter, felt the same. For years, he had invested millions into technology ventures and sleek startups, but the one investment that mattered most, Sophia's health, had nearly been destroyed under his nose. Money and influence had not protected her. What had saved her was Elena's courage. When he confessed this one evening as they watched Sophia sleep peacefully under the soft glow of the ROF hospital monitors, Elena's reply was steady. "If you want to make it right, use your power where it counts." Children like Sophia need more than private rooms in polished hospitals. They need someone to bring care to them before it's too late. That conversation was the seed of what would soon become the Butterfly Tree Project. The name came from Sophia herself. During recovery, she had told Elena about a dream where a great tree bloomed with hundreds of butterflies, each carrying light into dark corners. Elena had smiled and said softly, "That's what care should feel like." Daniel remembered the words. When he proposed launching a mobile healthcare initiative, he insisted it carry Sophia's imagery forward. A tree of life spreading wings across forgotten streets. The first van was modest, painted a deep navy with silver trim, its logo hand-drawn by a local artist. Inside, shelves held basic pediatric equipment, portable diagnostic kits, asthma nebulizers, and a small stock of vaccines. Elena insisted on one rule: no red tape. Care would be immediate, free, and focused on listening. "We don't just bring medicine," she told the small team of nurses and volunteers who joined the launch. "We bring presence." The first stop was Compton, a neighborhood where mothers often traveled hours to reach the nearest clinic. Dozens of parents lined up as the Butterfly Tree van pulled into a church parking lot. Children shuffled forward nervously, some coughing, others clutching worn inhalers. Elena worked side by side with the team, checking vitals, calming anxious mothers, and making sure every child left with more than just treatment, they left with hope. Word spread quickly. The van became a fixture in Los Angeles's underserved districts, rolling through South Central, Boyle Heights, and Inglewood. Local newspapers began covering the project, calling it a hospital on wheels. But Elena resisted the title. "We're not replacing hospitals," she clarified in interviews. "We're filling the silence where hospitals have failed." Momentum built faster than anyone expected. By the end of the first year, donations poured in, from school teachers, retired nurses, even anonymous parents who slipped notes into the mailbox. "You gave me back my child. This is all I can give." Daniel matched every contribution with his own funds, ensuring the project could expand without corporate interference. Soon, there were 3 vans, then 5 each painted with the same butterfly tree emblem. But the butterfly tree was never meant to be only about treatment. Elena believed lasting change required education and empowerment. She began recruiting teenagers from the very neighborhoods the vans served, training them as health ambassadors. These young people learned how to conduct basic screenings, teach families about nutrition and hygiene, and act as translators between medical professionals and their communities. For many, it was their first job, their first taste of responsibility. For Elena, it was planting roots. One such recruit was Luis, a high school junior from East LA, whose younger brother suffered from untreated asthma. After shadowing the team for weeks, he stood in front of a crowded gymnasium during a community event and declared, "I used to think hospitals weren't for people like us. Now I know we can bring health to each other." His words brought Elena to tears. It was working. The butterflies were spreading. By the second year, the butterfly tree gained federal attention. Representatives from the Health Resources and Services Administration invited Elena and Daniel to Washington to discuss scaling the model nationwide. Standing in the marble halls of Congress, Elena once again found herself behind a microphone. This time, she wasn't just telling the story of Sophia's survival, she was presenting data. Reduced ER visits in target areas, improved vaccination rates, a measurable drop in pediatric asthma emergencies. She spoke with conviction. This isn't charity. It's justice. Healthcare should not wait behind gates. It should arrive where it's needed most. The audience listened. For once, lawmakers who often spoke in abstractions about policy, reform saw a concrete model that worked. Pilot funding was approved for 5 additional living vans across California. The butterfly tree was no longer just a project, it was becoming a movement. Of course, not everyone welcomed it. Local clinics, threatened by the sudden popularity of mobile care, accused Elena of disrupting established systems. Private contractors worried about losing profitable emergency admissions. Whispers of sabotage emerged, delays in supply deliveries, anonymous complaints about improper protocols. But Elena had learned, from Detroit and from Beverly Hills, silence was the enemy. This time, she refused to shrink back. She went public with every attempt to obstruct the vans, turning each challenge into proof of why the project mattered. Through it all, Sophia grew stronger. She often rode in the van with Elena, wearing a t-shirt painted with bright butterfly wings. "Can I help, too?" she asked one afternoon as they unpacked medical kits. Elena knelt down, smiling. "You already are. Every child we help is because of you." Daniel watched from a distance, his heart swelling with gratitude and a humility he had never known in his boardrooms. By the third year, the Butterfly Tree Project had become a symbol not just of healthcare, but of resilience. Its vans rolled into neighborhoods long abandoned by policy and profit. Its youth ambassadors carried clipboards with the same pride, others carried diplomas. And its founder, once nearly silenced and discarded, had become a national voice. One evening, as the sun dipped over Oakland, Elena stood beside the 5th van, watching children chase each other in the fading light. Angela, her loyal ally, approached with a smile. "Funny, isn't it?" she said. "It all started with one poisoned IV bag." Elena's eyes softened. "No," she corrected gently. "It started with the choice to speak when it would have been easier to stay quiet." The butterfly tree had taken root, and as its branches stretched wider, Elena knew it was only the beginning. At first, the opposition came in whispers. An anonymous blog post questioning Elena Morris's credibility. A donor who suddenly pulled funding after receiving concerns about financial mismanagement. A pediatrician who had once volunteered for the Butterfly Tree Project quietly excused himself, citing personal reasons. Elena recognized the pattern. This wasn't coincidence, this was orchestration. Then the audits began. Men in suits, flashing badges from the Department of Health, appeared at the mobile clinics, with binders full of regulations. They combed through medical records, interrogated volunteers, and scrutinized supply chains. Every box of gloves, every vial of vaccine was inspected as though Elena's vans were laboratories of deceit, rather than sanctuaries of care. After 5 exhausting days, the reports came back clean. No violations, no irregularities. Yet the damage had been done. Parents called in panic, asking if their children were safe. Donations slowed. Fear had taken root, even if the accusations hadn't. Behind the curtain, Elena and her team began to hear a name spoken in low voices. The coalition. It was not a single enemy, but a network. Hospital executives angry that Butterfly Tree exposed their failures, contractors furious about lost billing profits, insurance brokers terrified of losing leverage in underserved markets. Together, they formed a shadow alliance. With one mission: dismantle Elena's movement before it spread too far. The attacks grew sharper. A false story circulated online claiming Elena had stolen medical supplies from a Detroit hospital years ago. Another blog twisted her testimony before Congress into a smear, painting her as a manipulator who used Sophia Hale's near-death experience to elevate her own profile. Elena read the words with a clenched jaw. The Cruelty was deliberate. They wanted to break her spirit before they broke her project. But she had learned from Detroit. Silence was a weapon, and she refused to hand it over. Instead of retreating, Elena went public. With the help of Angela Bryant, the veteran nurse, who had stood by her since the first crisis, she compiled a dossier of every suspicious audit, every anonymous smear, every irregular funding withdrawal. Daniel Hale, leveraging his wealth and connections, hired forensic investigators who traced digital fingerprints back to consulting firms tied to hospital boards. The coalition was sloppy, too confident in their invisibility. Evidence piled up like storm clouds. When the story broke in the Watchlight Journal, an independent investigative outlet, the headlines blazed across national screens. Operation Soot. The secret campaign to silence community health workers. The article revealed a coordinated effort not only against Elena, but against dozens of grassroots healthcare projects nationwide. Whistleblowers stepped forward. Nurses in Arizona. Administrators in Pennsylvania. Even a retired senator confessed. He had suspected such tactics for years, but lacked proof. Now, the proof had a face, and that face was Elena Morris. The coalition underestimated her resolve. They expected her to crumble under pressure. Instead, she turned every attack into fuel. At rallies, she held up the audit reports stamped, cleared of violations as evidence that fear, not facts, had driven the campaign against her. On television, she looked directly into the camera and said, "You can discredit me, you can threaten me, but you will not silence me. Because silence costs lives, and I will not pay that price again." Still, the threats became personal. One night, after a long day of clinics, Elena returned to her modest apartment to find the door ajar. Her belongings had been rifled through, though nothing of value was missing. It wasn't theft, it was a warning. Days later, Daniel received an anonymous voicemail. "Keep your daughter close. Accidents happen." For the first time, since the crisis with Vanessa, fear stabbed through his composure. He doubled Sophia's security detail, quietly moving her to a new school under watch. Elena, though shaken, refused to step back. "If they're threatening us this directly," she told Daniel, "it means we're winning." Her defiance galvanized the movement. Volunteers rallied closer. Donations that had dried up returned stronger than before, often accompanied by handwritten notes. "Don't stop. My child is alive because of you." Young ambassadors who had once been timid began speaking boldly at community events, declaring themselves part of the tree that no storm could uproot. The coalition tried one final blow, releasing doctored files alleging mismanagement of the piles. Butterfly tree funds. But Elena's team had anticipated this. With meticulous transparency, they live-streamed their accounting process, opening every ledger to public view. Journalists witnessed the entire audit in real time. By dawn, the coalition's smear collapsed under its own weight. What had been intended as scandal turned into spectacle, a demonstration of integrity against deception. It was in those days that Elena fully embraced her role, not just as a caregiver, but as a symbol of resistance. She spoke at rallies not with the polish of a politician, but with the raw honesty of someone who had lived both injustice and redemption. "The coalition thinks power is silence," she told a crowd in Oakland. "But power is a voice that refuses to be buried. And together, we are louder than their lies." Daniel stood at her side during many of these appearances, no longer the cautious billionaire, protecting his image, but a father indebted to the woman who had saved his child and a man who had found purpose in her mission. His presence lent weight to her words, but it was Elena's fire that drew people in. The butterfly tree vans continued to roll, louder and more visible than ever. Each engine hum was a defiance, each child treated a victory against the shadows. And though the coalition still lingered, plotting in quiet corners, they could no longer ignore the truth. What had begun as one woman's cry in a hospital ward had grown into a movement too vast, too rooted, too alive to destroy. As Elena stood one evening on the steps of Oakland City Hall, looking out at a sea of families, volunteers, and reporters, she felt no fear. Only certainty. They had tried to bury her with lies, but all they had done was give her roots deeper soil. And now, she thought with quiet resolve, let them come. The tree had wings. The courtroom was packed, the air charged with expectation. Vanessa Hale sat at the defense table, her designer suit tailored to project the image of a wronged woman. But the polished veneer cracked, as the prosecution played the surveillance footage once more. Vanessa, syringe in hand, injecting poison into Sophia's four. Gasps rippled through the chamber. No amount of rehearsed tears or eloquent excuses could erase the truth now illuminated on the screen. When the verdict came, it struck like a gavel through history. Guilty of attempted murder in the first degree. Vanessa's shoulders stiffened, her lips pressed tight, but her mask slipped at last. Rage flashed in her eyes as officers cuffed her hands. She spat words toward Elena. "This isn't over, you'll regret this before being dragged away." But her threats had no weight anymore. Justice had spoken. She wasn't the only one to fall. Diana Norwell, the quiet logistics officer who had enabled Vanessa's access, was convicted on charges of conspiracy and bribery. Other complicit staff, once hidden in shadows, were exposed for falsifying records and enabling security lapses. The network of silence, that had almost cost Sophia her life, was being dismantled, piece by piece. For Elena, it was both vindication and grief. Vindication, because she had screamed into the void and finally been heard. Grief, because so many had chosen to protect their reputations, instead of protecting a child. Yet the trial was not the end, it was the beginning. National attention surged, and Elena's name became impossible to ignore. At first, she resisted the cameras and microphones, preferring to return to the vans, to the children who needed her. But Daniel reminded her one evening as they stood outside Sophia's room. "If you don't tell this story, someone else will. And they'll get it wrong." So when Congress called, Elena went. She stood in the great chamber, the polished wood and marble radiating the weight of authority, and delivered the truth with a steady voice. "I was blamed once in Detroit for trying to save a child. Years later, I was nearly jailed for saving another. The system is designed to silence those who speak too loudly, especially women like me, women who are black, who are caregivers, who are easier to accuse than to believe." She lifted the printed emails and falsified reports uncovered during the coalition investigation. "Here is what fear of accountability looks like," she said. "Lies. Smears. Attempts to bury voices. But here is what courage looks like. A child alive because someone refused to stay silent." The chamber was silent, not out of disinterest, but reverence. Senators who had come, expecting a sob story, heard instead a manifesto. Elena was not begging for sympathy, she was demanding change. She called for funding of mobile health units, for protection of whistleblowers in healthcare, for laws that valued truth over image. She was not asking politely, she was insisting. News outlets captured every word. Across the country, families in waiting rooms and living rooms replayed her testimony. Nurses whispered her name with pride. Community workers cited her as proof that their struggles mattered. Elena Morris, once detained in handcuffs, was now being hailed as a symbol of justice and healthcare equity. Of course, not all celebrated. Critics labeled her radical, ungrateful, even dangerous. But Elena had learned long ago that criticism was simply the sound of power being rattled. She pressed forward, louder and stronger. The Butterfly Tree Project, once a handful of vans, expanded under federal support. Its youth ambassadors became local leaders, bridging divides between hospitals and the communities they served. Elena traveled across the state, then across the nation, speaking not only as Sophia's savior, but as the voice of countless families failed by silence. One evening, after another long day of testimony and travel, she returned to Oakland. Standing beside a van painted with the butterfly tree emblem, she watched Sophia run into her arms, her laughter ringing like a promise. Daniel stood nearby, quiet, humbled. Elena closed her eyes briefly, breathing in the moment. She had been accused, restrained, and nearly erased. But she had endured. And now she stood, not as a victim, but as a leader. A woman who had transformed injustice into a movement, and silence into a voice that could not be ignored. The trial was over. Justice had been delivered. But Elena knew her true work had only just begun. The years that followed saw the Butterfly Tree Project blossom beyond what anyone had imagined. What began as a single van circling forgotten neighborhoods grew into a fleet of mobile clinics stretching across California and beyond. Families in farm towns, inner city blocks, and rural highways learned to recognize the navy and silver vehicles not as symbols of charity, but as lifelines. Each stop meant vaccinations, asthma treatments, safe checkups, and most importantly, someone willing to listen. Through it all, Elena Morris never sought recognition. She turned down television profiles and corporate endorsements. Fame was never her purpose. Her measure of success came in quieter ways. A mother's sigh of relief when her child's breathing steadied, a teenager smiling after their first health exam in years, or Sophia's small hand slipping into hers, whispering, "You saved me, so now you save them too." Her message never changed. Healthcare is not a privilege for the wealthy. It is a basic right. For every child, every family, everywhere. And the truth, no matter how many try to bury it, will always find a way to rise. Elena's journey reminds us that speaking the truth may cost comfort, but silence always costs more. When we dare to stand up for what's right, even when the world doubts us, we create ripples that can become movements. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe healthcare should be a right for all? And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories about justice, courage, and hope. Because voices, like Elena's, remind us that change begins when someone refuses to be silent.